From Friday the 6th of June to Sunday the 8th of June 2014, the Green Foundation Ireland hosted a conference, a summer school, on the theme of greening the EU in the context of the Eurosceptic debate. What follows is an edited recording of some of the talks from the Saturday morning session. First, Peter Emerson looks at the way in which election results are sometimes dramatically affected by the way in which they are framed and set up. Then Jean Lambert of the English Greens, Maggie Chapman of the Scottish Greens, John Barry of the Green Party in Northern Ireland, and Maria Wetterstrand of Cogito, Sweden, address the issue of the UK's relationship with the EU.
As you said, I'm just back from Ukraine, and as you all know, in the Crimea they had a vote. And lots of people complained about the absence of any Ukrainian options or the status quo option. Lots of people complained about the presence of Russian troops, but nobody complained about the majority vote itself. And yet it is, in fact, the most inaccurate measure of collective opinion ever invented. It's 2,500 years old, or maybe 4,500, used by the ancient Sumerians. And it is no good, partly, well, it's inaccurate and inadequate. Partly because if I want to get the average age of everybody here, I could say, are you 67 years or no? And lots of people would say no, including myself. and if you just say no, if you don't express your age, then how can I possibly calculate it? And in some votes, people say no, Ulster says no, Gibraltar says no, Falkland says no, Republic of Srpska says no. You cannot actually identify the collective will of people if lots of them are saying no. Also, in a plural democracy, most options should be plural. Most questions should be plural. It's not a question like in Egypt, this referendum, this constitution, yes or no. There should be lots of options on the agenda. And even, I suppose there is one question which is actually two options, and that's the question, which side of the road should we drive on? The only country ever to hold a referendum on this question was Sweden, and they had three options on the ballot paper, and you could vote blank if you wanted to. And if I'd been Swedish, I would have voted blank. That was brilliant. But going back to that, the third nonsense of majority voting, you cannot identify a majority opinion because it has to be identified earlier if it's already going to be on the ballot paper. So, actually, you can't identify the collective will, you can't identify the majority will. What you can identify is the will of the person who wrote the question, which is why dictators various have used majority voting. Some of them have changed their electoral systems, some of them have changed the party systems, none of them have changed majority voting because, well, it's the perfect way of manipulating everybody. And the first person to manipulate properly was an Irishman. Napoleon was a bit of an amateur, really. He only got 99%. But the Irishman, Bernardo O'Higgins, when he became El Supremo, and he got 100%. Now, I've got Mossadegh down there. He wasn't really a dictator, but I'm including him because of the nonsense situation. In 1953, Iran votes 99% to be socialist. A couple of years later, 99% to be capitalist. And a few years later, 96%, actually, because there was a bit of a Sunni majority, to be neither socialist nor capitalist, but to be Islamic. It is a nonsense. So now, coming to the present debate, the UK and the EU and all that, you remember France had their vote on the Lisbon Treaty in 2005. And the question was, approuvez-vous, oui or non? And lots of people said yes, they were the people who liked the EU and liked the Lisbon Treaty. And of the people who said no, well, some people didn't like the EU, some people didn't like the treaty, some people didn't like McDonald's, some people didn't like Turkish accession, and je ne sais quoi. And all sorts of people voted no, so no wins. If the UK holds a yes-no option ballot on the EU, as Cameron has suggested and blah, 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 it will almost certainly be a no answer that comes out as a result. What the French should have done as an absolute minimum is to say Europe comme ci with the treaty, ou comme ça without the treaty. But that would only have been a ratification process. It would not have been a decision-making process, which is what a proper democracy should involve. And it's all right when you're talking about the Lisbon Treaty because nobody's getting killed, but when it comes to plebiscites like the Crimea or whatever, then life does get much more serious. And you get this sort of situation where the minority just does not even participate. And how can you possibly call this democracy? Oh God. And I include Northern Ireland. 97%, totally democratic, people would say Stalinist proportions. But it's always the same picture. The majority votes because the majority knows it's going to win, and the minority doesn't vote because what's the point of turkeys for Christmas and all that. And this was at the behest of the EU, the Parliamentary Commission. They persuaded people in the Balkans. There were referendums all over the place, and 4 of them caused a war. And it was similar in the Caucasus and elsewhere. But if you have a pluralist democracy, can I have 3 volunteers, please? The minimum plural democracy consists of 3 people with 3 different points of view. And we will imagine that these 3 people have decided to hold a party, which is fair enough, and they decide to buy a barrel of booze because it's cheaper that way, and they have these opinions. She wants ale, he wants bitter, and she wants cider. So, okay, they have a debate. And they realise that actually they have the following preferences. And they have a bit of a discussion about all this, and it all gets very complicated. And eventually they decide, well, we believe in majority voting, so the only thing to do is to take majority vote. But of course, with 3 options, you have to take 2 majority votes. So the obvious thing to do is to do it like this, I suppose. And if you do it A versus B, well, she prefers A to B, and she prefers A to B, and it's only he that prefers, so A wins, and then A to C, C to A, so C wins. So the democratic decision is C, unless you do it like this, in which case it's A, and unless you do it like this, in which case it's B, and you can vote any way you like, and you can get whatever answer you like. So if you are the chair, and if you know that there is no one option which has outright majority support, you can get whatever answer you like just by being totally democratic and deciding on the order of decisions. Now I'm going to present a different scenario because nobody has mentioned draft Guinness, option D. And it's pretty obvious that, well, really, all 3 of them prefer option D. And I'm now going to show you how I, totally democratic, totally impartial, are going to persuade them to want A. And before just taking a decision on this, I say, now, hang on, boys and girls, have you really thought of everything that's involved? Because what about bitter? What about cider? And these are actually just possibilities which you should consider. And I'm not changing anybody's opinion. It's always D that is better to A for all 3 people, but they do now have these preferences. And they chat away for a bit, I go and have a coffee, and then come back and say, okay, finished, right, let's take a vote. And if you do the vote, then you get the answer A by 67%, and who could possibly dispute that? And if you change the order of voting, of course you get a different answer. Thank you very much, you're all perfect Democrats. That sort of manipulation can also happen in a purely verbal process. When people are discussing things, and if somebody realizes that what they want is not going to be on, then you get, what about this, and they bring in another option and talk about that, and then suddenly you've got a different answer coming out. There are, in fact, lots of ways of making decisions, and you can have, if we start on this, oh, sorry, that wasn't meant to happen. Yeah. If we start on, there's the 0, and if we go along the x-axis and you increase the voter's choice, here it's a choice, it's a closed question, it's only one of 2 options, then you get one of some, and then you can vote on all of them. If you vote on all of them, then you can take all of them into account. If you vote on some of them, you can take some of them into account, and if you only cast one preference, you can only count the first preference. So the graph has a natural diagonal, and oops, done it again. And the good systems are the top right-hand corner, sorry. And the bad systems, it's known as the mother of democracy, it's actually the granny, and that's the majority vote. Okay, I'm now going to talk about what I would regard as proper decision making. And if you're coming together with me to talk about anything, you have a chair and you have a consensus. And then anybody can put any option that they like, as long as it complies with the UN Charter on Human Rights or some other criterion like that. And then you ask questions and blah, blah, blah. But every option must be an option in its full, in a full package. None of this amendment stuff, yes or no, and all that nonsense. So you put a full package, it might be very similar to another full package, but that doesn't matter. If it's a slightly different option, doesn't matter. You put it as a full package. And you have your debate. If you come to the end of the debate with a verbal consensus, then that's fine. And if you don't, then okay, let's everybody have a vote. And if you do vote, and if you're voting, let's say, with the UK in the EU, well, there are lots of different options, possibilities, and this is just off the top of my head. But there are always more than two ways of doing things. If you vote in a preference vote, if you cast only one option, then you only get 1 point. If you say something about this and nothing about the others, then you get 1 and nothing. If you vote for 2 options, then okay, and then 3, and then 4, and it's like that. So the incentive is to cast all your preferences. Nobody votes no, nobody votes against anybody or anything. You're always voting no, you're recognising the validity of other options, and so on. But you also have, for the protagonist, if I want my option to win, I need lots of high preferences, a few middle ones perhaps, but very few low ones. So it's worth my while talking to the erstwhile opponent and say, oh no, hang on, it's not that, blah, blah, blah. And so the whole system is totally inclusive. And also it is much more accurate than that horrible majority vote we spoke about earlier. And if it is more accurate, then it's more democratic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody, my name's David Finmore. I'm Professor of European Politics here at Queen's and Head of the School of Politics, Internationalist and Philosophy. I'm delighted to be here today and to see the event taking place at Queen's, and thanks to John for all the organisation, locally at least. The panel this morning is on rethinking the UK relationship with the EU, obviously a highly topical issue and one which is going to dominate or be certainly present in the British political debate over the forthcoming years, and I think there's obviously a fair bit of interest in the wider Europe on it as well. We've got 4 speakers this morning. We're going to give each of them about 15 minutes to give their views, and then we're going to open up the floor for discussion. 4 speakers this morning are, first of all, Maggie Chapman, councillor in Edinburgh and co-convener of the Scottish Green Party. She's going to give us a perspective from Scotland and also bring in a few comments in relation to the Scottish referendum and how that might be impacting on this. We're then going to move to Jean Lambert, MEP since 1999, who's going to provide some more European perspective on it. And then we're going to move to Maria Wetstand from Quito in Sweden, who's going to provide a broader European perspective as well. And then we'll come a bit more local with our own John Barry to look at the Irish perspective on this very interesting debate. So anyway, what to do?
I thought we were going to start with Jean.
Are we? Sorry. Yes, we were. Yes. Jean first.
That's what we agreed on.
With the broadest perspective, first of all. So yeah, we can go with Jean first.
All right, I was just getting really happy there.
Sorry.
Okay, shall I stand up? This is going to be a sort of meander, I have to say now, in terms of quite where we are in relation to a number of the questions we were asked to look at in this session. But, of course, just having come out of the European elections the other week and still trying to make sense of the result rather than... Well, there are all sorts of emotions that went through your head when you saw the results coming through. And as somebody who has now been in the European Parliament as long as Nigel Farage, which apparently makes me a career politician but doesn't make him a career politician, which is an interesting definition within all of this, and part of the issues about the language that's used around so-called discussions and debates about the European Union, certainly from sort of the British perspective. I think that one of the things that we're very clear on about that election result was that there's a sort of historical view some time back for a general election result where one of the national newspapers came out with the headline, it was the Sun what won it. And I think there are a lot of people who are wondering whether this time round it wasn't the BBC plus a whole set of other papers that actually won the election, insofar as you can win an election when you are one constituent part of 28 constituent parts with no overall majority anyway. What does winning mean? But the party that came out with the largest percentage, certainly many people felt that not only did they get their own airtime as a party, but that the whole discussion almost about the European elections was very much about what do you think of UKIP. And the very rare opportunities that the Greens got to get anywhere near a minute or two on the BBC when we were allowed to finish sentences, the debate was basically, what do you think about UKIP? Which could have been a very short response, but I was polite. So took it, to have a go at some of the wider issues. And I think what's been very interesting in this election is that, and Maggie will say more about sort of seeing UKIP now arrived in Scotland, which is going to be very interesting in terms of discussions about referendums, given that, UKIP, as far as I understand it, don't think there should be a Scottish referendum, but maybe you'll know more, but only the one they want. We've seen them return again in Wales. They already had a seat in Wales. That was not new. And with increased representation in most regions of England, apart from, I'm extremely pleased to say, London, yes, which is my region where we managed to keep it to just the one seat again. So I think there is a big question here about how to sort of challenge interpret this sort of so-called challenge to the political order. And this is not just a question for the UK, it's a question that's now being asked, I think, in many countries across the European Union. What do we make of the election results that we've got? What do we make of the fact that we still have the two largest blocs in the European Parliament will still be the European People's Party and the Socialist and Democrat blocs? Not quite in the way that the polls were foretelling some time back, opinion polls were foretelling some time back, but that you're seeing an increase and an increased fragmentation almost in parties represented, and you will see sort of there's a whole sort of question now as we're setting up the new political groups in the European Parliament, how many groups there will be, what will the balance of power be between those particular political groups as people go fishing. Because, of course, a lot of it in the power in the European Parliament it links to group size. It's not the only thing, but it certainly links to it. And at the moment, and I'll say a bit more about this in a couple of minutes, it looks as if the European Conservatives and Reformers, an interesting concept, but maybe the third political bloc, which is not what people were foreseeing. They thought that it would be the United Left or Marine Le Pen's grouping. So this whole sort of strengthening, really, of the sort of smaller groups away from the two larger ones. So, and that I don't think is something which has only been happening in the European Union, European Parliament elections. And I think this issue about this increasing grand coalition style of politics in a number of countries is something which I'm sure a lot of you have already done quite a bit of research on. And it's part of how do we handle that greater plurality that's there. Certainly in the UK we saw the party of In, the Liberal Democrats, coming in fifth place, which if you're looking at this idea that this would be a choice between in or out of the European Union, again, what do we make of the fact that it's the Liberal Democrats who came in fifth place in many, certainly in England, beaten by the Greens. Into fourth place, which much good did it do us in some areas. But, what does this mean? Because actually, at the end of the day, most of the parties that the largest number of votes have gone to parties that actually want us to stay within the European Union, albeit within some sort of changed way. But certainly, there's a question that's now being asked as well about well, I mean, one other thing, of course, on the Liberal Democrats is that, you know, do you interpret their position as because of their position on the European Union or because they're a junior party in coalition? And some here may have various experiences of being members of parties, junior parties in coalition. And what happens to you as that party, regardless of what your position is on whatever the election is that's currently being fought. There are questions being asked as well at the moment in the Labour Party, because certainly there are parts of the country that have been seen as solid Labour, and I think this may be part of our political problem, where sort of traditional blue-collar, working class, almost in some respects, you know, you can almost see it as a small c conservative sort of Labour support switching to UKIP. And, you know, what's now being called the sort of the group of those who consider themselves left behind. Others tend to describe it more as the grumpy old men vote. But it's, you know, how is it that UKIP has managed to get a purchase there? And part of the answer may be because these have been absolutely solid, safe seats, and therefore what work has actually gone on in them, how involved have people and representative have people really felt, particularly under a first past the post system. And of course we're also seeing within this greater analysis too of David Cameron's struggle with his own backbenchers and with his own group in the European Parliament, which at times does not support the government position. If you watch their votes on climate change, they don't necessarily support the government position on that. And we know that there is a disagreement as well within Conservatives in the European Parliament, just as there is in the party at Westminster, about even membership of the European Union, let alone what sort of Europe, even if you want to stay in. So one of the big sort of political questions that has been instrumentalised in this debate, in my view, in this last election, and in the run-up to it, has certainly been about migration and about free movement, and within the European Union, and actually really challenging that sort of key freedom. And it interests me that many of those who challenge that are perfectly happy with the free movement of goods, capital and services. It's just people they have trouble with. And this is also becoming part of a wider debate, I think, about identity. Do you lose your national identity, your regional identity within the European Union? Do you lose your sort of perceived almost historical cultural identity within the European Union? And part of this is the whole issue, I think, of the representation of the hardline anti-migrant parties who have their own definition about belonging and identity based on your history and increasingly your faith. And this has been one of the things that's been used very, very much, I think. This whole question about the threat to Christian Europe from Islam. And I was watching the news here last night, and I gather you have your own problem here on that. But this has really been part of the debate. If you look at what's been happening in the Netherlands, if you look at the way in which it's been used by the BNP, even to some extent by UKIP and others, by Marine Le Pen, this line is one of the sort of the fracture lines. And we're seeing this now as well within the setting up of the new groups in the European Parliament about who won't work with whom. And, you know, one of the drop-off points for UKIP, Nigel Farage, has been he will not join a group set up by Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders. They will not have in their group Jobbik and Golden Dawn. So there are these very interesting points which appear clear, but actually underneath that there's a lot of very fuzzy borders, which normally I'm in favour of, but not always. The European Conservatives and Reformists, their fishing expedition has now brought them the Danish People's Party, where, you know, Morgan Messerschmidt there has, you know, a conviction, albeit a number of years ago, in terms of his hate speech against Islam, that this is certainly creating difficulties in the British Conservatives about whether or not that party should even be in there. And of course, the people who went fishing for those people to join the ECR are also Conservatives who are absolutely opposed to the UK's continuing membership of the European Union. We have, I think, the true Finns now as well within the ECR. So there's some interesting configuration going on there. In terms of where it takes us back to the referendum in the UK, well, first let's define what the UK will be, should there ever be a referendum. Maybe you say something on that. And the parties' different positions on it. UKIP, well, it's when do we want a what do we want a referendum? When do we want it now? And you're a bunch of lying so-and-sos because you've promised us this, but you can't chant that so easily. So then the Tories, Cameron has been boxed almost into his own position of saying, well, 2017, if the Conservatives win the next general election, 2017, after renegotiation, you see all the questions that arise in this sequence that he has there. Labour, Liberal Democrats have basically been saying, well, next time there's a major treaty change, be a referendum. We already have an act on the statute books on that anyway. And, my own party's position has basically been, well, it's not our decision, but okay, 2017 if you insist, I suppose. Chances of renegotiation? How many of us here? We all have an opinion. It's going to be immensely difficult. And it will also be that if the renegotiation that Cameron wants goes ahead, we are exactly in the bind that he was explaining earlier on, for a lot of us that want to stay in, but certainly wouldn't want the renegotiated European Union that Cameron is looking at. Not least because the arguments that he uses for that, looking at an article he wrote recently, it's about, it talks about interference in our everyday lives as excessive. Most people don't have a clue, but you keep being told it's excessive, okay, you start to believe that. We're being sucked into the United States of Europe, but actually this is a party that the Conservatives quite like the United States generally, but anyway, maybe that's more on the trade. People worry that European rules have allowed people to claim benefits without working here. And this is one of the key reasons in his article. And given that the government can't really provide the figures on that, I think it's a really, really nasty sort of way of setting out the argument. But he's certainly talking in some very general terms, but business is liberated from red tape, and what he actually means there is not just red tape, but green tape. Expansion of the market, the new transatlantic trade and investment partnership with the States, which Labour also likes. It has a go at the justice system and includes the European Court of Human Rights in that, which is not the European Union, but don't let the details bother you. And a whole set of things about sort of challenging ever closer union. He has a whole set of, which of course is ever closer union of the peoples. But so there's a whole set of things that he is after sort of weakening in order to strengthen particularly the trade dimension. Is he going to get any shift on free movement? Well, there's, we're looking again at coordination of social security systems. I spent 10 years of my life on that. In the next parliament, he may get a slight movement. But the British government have royally upset the governments Central and Eastern Europe over this whole issue. I mean, the anger that there is there and this sense of betrayal that the British have tried to stop the move towards free movement from countries that, they wanted into the European Union has really upset people there. So is he going to get something there? The way he's handling the current presidency of the European Commission, how many friends is this going to get him? So there's a whole set of questions about, he can say that, yes, I will go in, I will renegotiate, I will get this, this and this, I have friends. The chances, I think, it's a very interesting discussion there. Let alone that if he has to get some of this stuff through the new European Parliament, it's very difficult to foresee what's going to happen with it. And that the appetite for a new treaty, I don't think, is necessarily top of the shopping list of most governments in the European Union. So, we live in interesting times. This new Parliament is going to be, well, we don't quite know yet. It may be very much more like the old one than people think it is, particularly given that it looks as if UKIP is having trouble even forming a political group in the new Parliament. So we will see. But who knows? We look forward to 2015, later in 2014, then to 2015, maybe 2017. And in the meantime, we've forgotten the climate negotiations next year, haven't we? So
adding to the mix is Scotland, the outcome of the referendum. So over to you, Maggie.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. I want to, in contrast to Jean, maybe be a little bit more parochial and speak to you a little bit about what's going on in Scotland at the moment. And much of what I say is very much from my own perspective. I am a councillor in Edinburgh, Green councillor for Leith Walk in Edinburgh, and I'm also co-convener of the Scottish Green Party. So that's my political context, but what I'm saying is very much from my own perspective, I suppose. I think one of the things that, for those of you who maybe aren't as wrapped up in Scottish politics as I am, on the 18th of September this year, Scotland will be voting on independence. We have an independence referendum. It is a yes-no question. Should Scotland be an independent country? That is the question that will be on the ballot paper. And yes, no, there isn't a blank option for those people who remain undecided. But I think the independence debate in North Britain, as some Westminster media has referred to it as, is important for the whole of the UK and beyond. I think it will have repercussions way beyond Hadrian's Wall, but also beyond the English Channel, beyond the Irish Sea. And I should also say I am personally in favour of independence, and the Scottish Green Party's position is to support independence and to campaign for independence. Many people have said that for 15 hours, from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. on the 18th of September, Scotland holds true sovereignty for the first time in 300 years. In those 15 hours, we have the opportunity to take control or not of the future of our nation. Sovereignty will lie with the people, not with an unelected head of state. And in those 15 hours, we get the opportunity to choose the kind of Scotland that we want to live in, the kind of Scotland that we want to build for the future. And in and of itself, that is an immense privilege. I think there are very few of us who can say in our lifetimes that we have that opportunity, and I'm hugely privileged to be part of that. For me, the independence campaign is about many things, but democracy, social justice, those are my two most important elements for this. And we can see the way in which those ideas in Scotland have reinvigorated politics. Politics in Scotland has changed, and by politics I mean politics with a small p. What happens in pubs on a Friday night? What happens in the supermarket queues? Those kinds of things, those kinds of discussions and debates have been transformed in the last couple of years because of what's going to happen on the 18th of September. And we can see that in sort of structural politics as well. A year and a half ago, in Glasgow, over 900 people gathered for what was the first radical independence conference. RIC, as it's come to be known, Radical Independence Campaign, has mobilised a grassroots campaign that we haven't really seen in Scotland, arguably anywhere in the UK, on that sort of scale, with that sort of impetus for a very, very long time. So 900 people gathered in the Radisson Hotel. I understand, I appreciate the tensions in that statement. And, you know, in the run-up to that first conference, the discussion about that weekend was, oh yeah, you know, those lefties, those radicals, will just let them get on with it. Halfway through the day, we got a message, the Radical Independence Campaign got a message from Alex Salmond, First Minister of Scotland, saying, well done for what you're doing, you know, jolly good show type thing. Keep doing it. And he hadn't mentioned us before. He hadn't talked about us. He hadn't talked to us before. And I think that shows that for so long, politics has been something that happens so far removed from everybody's day-to-day lives that there wasn't really that connection. But here were 900 people gathered to talk about something that he supposedly cared passionately about and yet had no involvement in. And so we got this message, you know, well done, keep going, carry on. And that weekend shifted the debate because they realised that actually it was this is a people's movement. This is about people choosing, not politicians choosing. And I think that really has been very, very significant. And last year, our second Radical Independence Conference, over 1,000 people gathered. You know, so it was 1,000 largely different people. So other people doing conferences in other parts of Scotland. There's one in Inverness not so long ago, building support for, building momentum for something different. And I think what for me is so important about this campaign is that it's for something, and it's for something positive. It's not against something. It's not, let's stop this. Let's campaign against that. It's, let's build something new. Let's build something better. Let's build something good. And that, in and of itself, is hugely motivating to be part of. Having said that, one of my biggest disappointments in this whole campaign is a lack of a positive vision coming from the other side. The Yes campaign is the official Yes campaign. The No campaign is under the umbrella Better Together. And it's been called all sorts of things from Bitter Together to Project Fear. Project Fear was actually a name that it gave itself. So, you know, that gives you the kind of tone of the debate. And obviously much, much worse. And I'm still waiting for a positive vision of Scotland in the Union to come from Better Together. I haven't seen it yet, and it looks like it's a long way coming. And especially when the language we hear from the unionist politicians, and unionist in the Scottish unionist sense, not Northern Irish, complex terminology. Joanne Lamont, the leader of Scottish Labour, said that she was in a TV debate with Nicola Sturgeon, Deputy First Minister of Scotland, SNP, and Joanne Lamont said that the Scottish people are not genetically programmed to make political decisions. That is a direct quote. That's, I don't think, what she meant to say. You know, I think what she was trying to say is there's nothing innately different about Scotland in its ability to govern itself compared to the rest of the UK. But that's not what she said, and I think that's quite telling. Alistair Darling, who's the sort of political lead of Better Together, has compared Alex Salmond to Kim Jong-il, and you know, ranted on about blood and soil, and this was Salmond's sort of dictatorship that he was trying to create. And for the first time, there'd been many such challenges thrown at Salmond, and for the first time he reacted. He said, "I'm demanding an apology." And I think, you know, the only senior politician in the UK who's committed to the unilateral removal of Trident weapons from Scottish soil, that's to be compared to North Korean dictators, probably irked him enough to get that kind of response. And UKIP, well, having just come through the European elections where, sadly, UKIP now is one of the 6 MEPs that Scotland sends or doesn't send to Brussels, depending whether he chooses to turn up or not. He's David Coburn, the UKIP Scottish MEP, has compared salmon to Robert Mugabe. Now, I'm from Zimbabwe. I was born and brought up in Zimbabwe, and salmon is no Mugabe. There are all sorts of comparisons that we might make, but Mugabe certainly isn't one of them. So the whole language of the No campaign is around fear, it's around belittling Scotland, it's around tarnishing Scottish politics as being either completely insignificant to Scotland, never mind the rest of the world, or it's about saying that Scotland is, going down the line of dictatorship and that kind of thing. And there's nothing positive coming out of that, nothing at all. And that, I think, is I'm sad about that, because I think, there should be. There probably is a positive case for the union to be made. It's just not happening anyway. But it's back to what the campaign can deliver. I think it can change the face of, and it is changing the face of British politics. We are moving the debate away from the austerity politics that we hear coming out from Westminster time and time again. What can we cut next? What can we reduce public expenditure on next? To a renewed vision of what our country or our European Union or our British Isles could be like, and how we relate to others around the world. So there are lots of really, really good reasons for Scotland to become independent. And I want to talk a little bit about some of them, but just to say up front that for me nationalism is not one of them. And yes, it is the Scottish National Party that has got us to where we are. We would not have that opportunity on the 18th of September if it weren't for the SNP. But last night we were talking about how we move away from the sort of national focus or the nationalist focus of remembrance in the wars of the 20th century, giving the sort of historical context to where we are now. And that really struck a chord for me. Eric articulated very, very well, I think, why that sort of approach to nationalism is so pernicious and so problematic. And that's not... But that isn't what we see coming out of this grassroots radical campaign for a new Scotland. What matters are political structures that engage people, that include people, that encourage the participation of the citizens that those structures are there to serve. Economic principles not stacked against the majority. Community organising that is supported, not squashed, not kettled by the London Metropolitan Police. And we've seen so many situations in Britain over the last few years, decades, where the British government clearly isn't delivering. It's not delivering for the people of Scotland. It's not delivering for anybody other than a few very wealthy individuals in London. And I don't see, given the political context, Labour saying again, we won't reverse the cuts, we won't reverse the welfare reform changes that the Tories have brought in. I don't see that shifting within the UK as it currently stands. There has to be something that breaks, something that changes. And perhaps Scotland voting yes in September is what does that. I just want to make a little bit of a link to Europe, if I might. One of the things that was very clear to me in the European campaign was as soon as we started talking about any topic whatsoever, from the unionist parties, the Conservatives, Labour, UKIP, Liberal Democrats, it was said, EU membership is important, and where would Scotland be? Where would Scotland be, in or out of Europe? Where would the UK be, in or out of Europe? And I think that's something that has backfired dramatically on those unionist parties, because Scotland is very, very clearly pro-European. in a way that we don't see that upswelling of anti-Europeanness that is happening across the UK. So Scotland supports the EU, but wants reform in the EU, and hopefully in our discussions we can talk about what some of those reforms might be. I just want to. One thing I think Greens have a real contribution to this debate. Scotland, Britain, whatever Britain looks like, and EU around reform. And I guess I'll leave you with a challenge. As Greens, we've been very good at talking to ourselves about what kind of reform we want. Ourselves either in our own little areas or across Europe. But we need to broaden that out. Why is it that, as we heard last night, that the countries that are able or are beginning to fight against austerity are countries where the left and the Greens have united? And that's what we need to be looking at. How do we work together to bring those ideas, those radical ideas of a positive future together? Because we aren't going to be able to do it on our own. We as a Green movement cannot deliver it on our own. So that's the challenge. How do we get over our sort of rivalries, our left and political rivalries in that radical future to deliver this transformation that we are seeing happen in Scotland? The Radical Independence Campaign at a very small level, 4.5 million people. It's a campaign for 4.5 million people. How do we magnify that up to the European level? That, I think, is a challenge. But if we get it right, then we solve, or we have the potential to solve, the problems around austerity, around climate change, around a whole range of things that are making a lot of people's lives miserable. So I'd be very interested to hear what you say, how you think we can do that. Thank you.
Rather nicely to link in what Maggie says, I mean, the Greens, and I speak with a couple of hats on, small man, big head, many hats, Green Party councillor, but also academic, and David's my boss, so I've got to watch what I say, is that we're proud unionists, both European unionists, but also trade unionists. And I think this partly speaks to the issues that Maggie has raised in terms of political strategy for the Green parties in the European Union and indeed across the various states in which we have representation. And I think it's something that, again, Maggie's raised and also Jane, and I'm sure it'll come up, is that Greens are not unapologetic or uncritical supporters of the European Union. I mean, many of the parties, particularly the one that I belong to, we were quite Eurosceptic back in the day, and quite a lot of scepticism around the euro and so on. But what's interesting on the island of Ireland is that we haven't seen the growth of a far-right party. Now, don't hang me for this, we can come back to the discussion, because some of the existing parties may already function like that. I think when Nigel Farage came to Belfast, he kind of looked around at our local political system and says, God, I'm quite mainstream in comparison to... At least I'm not trying to refight the Reformation or deny climate change is happening, or say that intelligent design is an adequate substitute for Darwinian theories of evolution. And that's how parochial we are. I often think that in Northern Ireland it would be progressive if we were in the 19th century. But we are dealing with 21st century issues, which I think we shouldn't forget in these debates about the fallout of the European elections, the positions of Greens and other progressives in that, is that, and Peter mentioned this in terms of, it hasn't really received the attention that it deserves, but part of what's going on between Russia, Ukraine and Europe has to do with gas. Has to do with the new geopolitics of energy. It's directly linked to why the DUP here locally, or the Conservatives in Westminster, will frack our land. And now in the Queen's speech, whereby removing citizens' rights in terms of allowing fracking companies to begin drilling under your private property. I mean, this is the politics of addiction. It's addiction. We are hooked on hydrocarbons. That explains for me everything from the war in Iraq, what's happening now in the geopolitics of the standoff between the European Union, Russia and the Ukraine, the politics of fear. And there really is a politics of fear around energy. It's the classic what's going to keep the lights on, which is why fracking for Fermanagh and Leitrim. It's interesting that many environmental issues don't respect borders, certainly issues of energy, never mind pollution. But I would place that front and centre as the major issue and a proud contributions that Greens and the wider Green movement can say that we constantly have as a focus. But as Jean said, it's a bit like a Punch and Judy show. So we're all looking over here at UKIP and the rise of xenophobia, which we have to, issues of identity. We're cooking the planet. And there is an issue of how can we, and this may be part of the issue that Maggie has raised, is that, and I certainly speak here from my own political experience in Northern Ireland, is that I think there's a danger in which you can disparage and criticise the likes of Farage and the rise of the right, and it's like, isn't it awful, all these people going on about identity and so on, I wish they could just move on, is that is very condescending as well as political suicide. We have to find a way in which we can attend to issues of identity and people feeling insecure. I think the politics of fear only works when there's insecurity. And we are now facing a recession, which I think is actually a typo, it's a depression. At what point does a recession actually become a depression, the type of which we've not seen since the 1930s, in terms of particularly the 18 to 24-year group being
much nowadays as it was a few years ago. So when people were asked this election, what were the most important issues in the European election, the environment was on top. And that was, of course, the main reason for the good result for the Greens. I mean, all the other parties, they try to talk about the environment, but they are not as trustworthy as we are. People don't, the Conservatives, their first candidate was a man in the, I don't know how old he is, maybe 65 or something like that, very, very conservative, and he's voted against everything that would have made the environment better in the EU Parliament. So, they didn't have very much to say on that issue, while we had a really strong candidate. But the other thing was that we got a new political party in this. They are not new, but it was the first time they entered the European Parliament, and it's a feminist initiative. Mm-hmm. So they became very much the center of attention in this debate in Sweden. And they certainly took some of our votes. Of course, they were not ours since we didn't get them, but they could have been ours if it had not been for them. So we could have made maybe even a better result without them. But they will also get one seat in the European Parliament. And I hope the Green Group will manage to get them to join, because I think they will feel more comfortable with the Greens than with the left socialists. The discussion was about the environment and equality and feminism. So those old political parties didn't have very much to say, actually. But we also have in Sweden the Sweden Democrats, who got 9.7%, and they are this nationalist ex-Nazi party, which oppose immigration and hate foreigners. It's always interesting to think about how all these political parties will cooperate with each other when they all hate foreigners. But they didn't get 10%. They only got 9.7%. So that's, we think, positive in the Greens in Sweden. In Finland, you had the True Finns, which is they don't have any Nazi history. They are more nationalists, countryside nationalism. And they got, I think, 12%, something like that. But they had, the result was not as good as the last election to the Finnish parliament. So you could see that also as maybe a positive sign that they actually declined a bit from that. So they have not been the center of attention in this discussion, in this European election. And in Sweden, since we are not members of the Euro, we have not discussed at all things connected to that. There were some parties having signs saying yes to the Euro or no to the Euro, which is quite stupid in the campaign for the European Parliament, since it's not an issue for the European Parliament to decide whether Sweden should be a member of the Euro or not. But, they want to send the signals and there was also one saying yes to nuclear power, which is not obviously decided by the European Parliament. So the campaign is a bit like that, but we had not so much focus on that kind of issues. While in Finland, they have had lots of discussion about the euro and the austerity, and especially the true Finns have won votes on opposing that Finland should pay money to save Greece and such things, while the Greens have been more trying to preserve the euro. While in Sweden, the Greens are against the euro. So we have some different opinions on that. The Swedish Green Party was against the membership of the European Union in 1994. In 1995, we actually made a better result in the European elections than we did this time. We got 17% and 4 MEPs. And that was because we won lots of votes from nationalists that time by opposing the EU membership, talking about sovereignty and independence and decentralization and such things. And actually, we had some problems with that afterwards. For many years, we had to work hard to get those people to leave the Green Party. By promoting more liberal regulations concerning immigration and such things, we finally got them to decide that it was not for them to be members of the Greens. So we had to actually force some of them out. but nowadays, the Greens are the strongest. We have the strongest support amongst our voters and our members when it comes to liberal rules for migration. So it's both for migration from Eastern Europe and immigration from other countries from outside Europe. So it's both. And it's both asylum seekers and job seekers that people say yes to from the green perspective in Sweden. So when we also had another problem, and that was that it became more or less a religious religion for the Greens in Sweden to oppose the EU membership. You know how sometimes in political parties some issues become almost religious, that you're not even allowed to say that you have another opinion. And people who try to say like, well, you see, I think that EU might be a good idea, actually, and maybe we should be members of the EU. They were outvoted from the lists. They were not elected to the board of the party. They were people who were like talking behind their backs and saying, you know, this guy, he's pro-EU. Don't vote for him. But I personally gradually changed my opinion. From the beginning, I also opposed membership, and one of the reasons was that Sweden had very strong regulations when it comes to environmental issues. And we were afraid that the EU should force us to become, to become worse when it came to that. And also it did actually on some issues, like chemicals, for example. We have been forced to allow certain chemicals that were forbidden in Sweden before the membership. But it's also there on the other hand, there are things that are really good with cooperating in the EU when it comes to these environmental issues that are really across the borders, and you have to cooperate to do something. And I gradually changed my opinion, and in 2007, in 2008, as a spokesperson, I wrote an article to our the newspaper that all the members of the party got. I wrote an article and say, I have changed my opinion. I think we should be members of the EU. And everyone who had done that before had been blacklisted and not allowed to be more or less members of the party or active members of the party before. But I felt that I have to do this because I cannot sit in another discussion not being able to talk about European politics, but always only had to talk about our wanting to leave the European Union. I mean, I couldn't say anything about what we want to do for the environment, what we think about EU's work on climate change, or anything, because I always had only to discuss the question of whether Sweden should leave the EU or not. So I felt that I have to say this, and if they force me to leave, I'll leave. That's okay with me. But it was like opening a Pandora's box. And person after person came out saying that I agree with you. And I have agreed with you for several years, actually. I have not dared to say anything. So we had a referendum in the Greens in Sweden if we should continue to oppose membership in the EU or not. And my side won with like 55 to 45%. And some people were, of course, unhappy with that, but mostly people were feeling okay with the decision. It was like a democratic process, and lots of discussions around the country, and both sides got exactly the same amount of money to campaign, and, you know, those important things that you need to make people feel that they are actually able to say their opinion before the referendum. So we had that discussion. And I think it was very, very important, because we would not have got this result in this EU election if we hadn't changed our opinion on the membership of the EU, because we would still be sitting there only discussing whether we should be members or not. And when you look at Euroscepticism, I know in many countries Euroscepticism is right-wing. It's a right-wing thinking that EU is too socialist, or thinking that EU is a problem because you will have all these people from other countries coming to your country. And in Sweden, as in the UK, we believe that if we open the borders, everyone will want to live in our country. But if you ask people from Syria, for example, I don't think most of them actually think that, oh, well, I would like to live somewhere where it's really cold and they speak a language that is nothing I've ever heard before. But we have this idea that everyone would like to come to us. Well, I think that when we discuss the EU issues in Sweden, these issues, the right-wing Euroscepticism is not very strong, but it is there, of course, it is. But in Sweden, we also have this left-wing Euroscepticism. The left party in Sweden are still opposing membership. And they are opposing it because they think EU is capitalist. So they think it's too much like the market. The market is actually the ones who are in charge of everything, and it's only the money that can run for free, and people are not allowed to move wherever they like, but it's just the money and the companies that are traveling around and such things. And then we used to have also the green Euroscepticism. So we have lots of different types of Euroscepticism in Sweden. And it is a balance, of course. It's very much of a balance to try to balance between the decentralization issue, which is very green and very important, and the nationalism that is the risk that you get caught in when you oppose the EU. So, and I can imagine it's a bit the same in Scotland when you are trying to promote independence, that you will in some ways also be connected to those people who are nationalists. And in my hometown in Sweden, we will have a referendum in September also about sovereignty, actually independence, to be independent from the rest of the municipality where we stay in. And I'm opposing that because it's more of a nationalistic way of discussion. They say, we don't want our tax money to go to those people who live over there. And they are usually immigrants, those other people that you don't want your tax money to go to. So I think if you want to have a Eurosceptic discussion, you must always be aware of the risk that you will fall into the nationalist discussion. If the UK would renegotiate the membership in the EU, I think that would be very dangerous, actually, for the rest of the EU. Because, I mean, if the UK will get to renegotiate the membership, why would not all the other countries be allowed to do the same? I can imagine the true Finns in Finland would gain a lot of votes from that, because they would demand also that Finland should renegotiate their membership in the EU. And maybe in Sweden, the Sweden Democrats would do the same, saying that we could actually, if the UK can renegotiate the membership, we could do the same. I don't think the Scottish independence will influence that much, because I cannot see any part of Sweden wanting to leave Sweden yet. But I think this can be really a problem for the rest of the EU. Well, I think the situation now in the EU is it is a bit worrying with all these political parties coming in. But I don't really believe that all of Europe is becoming racists or Nazis, actually. I think many parts of Europe, also the Green movement and the equality movements, social movements, are getting stronger at the same time, and we need to build on that in the future.
To what extent do you think that an unspoken factor in British Euroscepticism, particularly the funding of UKIP and David Cameron's slightly bizarre positions, is the fear of the City of London about a financial transaction tax, not only the actual financial cost of that, but the potential for scrutiny of those transactions?
I'd just be interested to know the panel's views on what the role of the EU is. Now, at the moment, we were discussing this morning the UK relationship with the EU, but I'd just be interested to know what the actual role of the EU is. I think we touched on it last night in terms of the commemoration of war and the fact that the EU came about as a peace and economic initiative, but with so many fewer people now that actually remember the war firsthand. And I mean, John mentioned the fact that he has so many students coming out now, and they don't have the same economic opportunities, and they don't remember the war. They don't know why the EU actually exists. So just be interested to know the speakers' views on what the role of the EU is at the moment.
Hi, my name is Ivan McKeown. It's been touched upon so far to a certain extent. I'd just like to hear the panel's views further on the referendum in Scotland and what the implications would be for Scotland itself. Hopefully positive, and I would be certainly personally very much a supporter of Scotland.
Okay, we take those three questions first. Jean, do you want to
Yeah, all the easy ones. I think with the issue about the implications of the referendum Scotland, I mean, that's certainly part of the discussion about that people may be aware is how this plays, for example, in Spain, and the independence movement there coming from Catalonia, and of course the historical sort of Basque issue. So there is I think a nervousness in some parts of the European Union about this. On the other hand, it's also anything sort of subnational is seen as not the EU's business. So there is this interesting sort of tension there, which we saw in sort of Barroso's comments on it. I think one of the issues that sort of comes up in this is about borders. What are the borders? How does that work? That if Scotland becomes independent, then technically, that there is this issue about technically is Scotland still a member of the European Union or not? Probably not. In which case, that then becomes the external border of the European Union. What are the implications of that? What are the implications for free movement? Certainly one of the big questions that exists in London, we have 1 million EU nationals in London, is that if the UK as a whole decides that it wants to leave the European Union, what then are the rights of million EU nationals living in London, the 2.3 in the UK as a whole, and 2.5 UK nationals living elsewhere in the European Union. You can discuss this for hours. It is possible, I know this. And it's a really interesting discussion, particularly whether you then want to become Switzerland, Norway, or none of the above. That also, of course, if the UK leaves, then we're in this question too about what's the border here. And let alone any of the implications about currencies, certainly financial regulation, etc., etc. But in terms of the British Euroscepticism, part of that being concerns about the financial city of London, views vary. I mean, certainly view I know from some who work in the city is the city makes money, it doesn't matter what the system is. The
house always wins.
The house always wins, absolutely. And that they will work with that. But certainly a real concern, and it's quite an interesting one when you look at this within the trade relationships with the United States, where people say with the US has stronger financial regulation. Much good did it do them, but it has stronger regulation. What are the implications for the European Union? What's the implication for the City of London? And yet, Cameron still wants that trade agreement. So there are all sorts of tensions going on there, but certainly one of the things that Cameron will define as being British national interest, and Labour does it as well, effectively, and I think to Lib Dems, is pretty much the financial city. How much will the European Union actually affect the ability of the financial city of London to be the economic powerhouse, UK as a whole and generally? And this is, you saw it within all the discussions about the fiscal treaty, etc. Cameron basically defining their UK national interest being equivalent to the interests of the City of London. So it's a concern. And in terms of what the EU role is, I think at the moment the European Union is actually searching for a role. That certainly what it was telling itself about sort of peace on the continent was really shaken with the Balkans and Kosovo, and therefore how to respond to that. That look, here we were, European Union coming out, supposedly being part of a factor for peace on the continent. Why wasn't it? Why couldn't it work on that? Then a shifting feeling about what it's about, increasing prosperity, increasing sort of, the financial crisis has certainly shaken that. So I think at the moment there is this feeling that it's almost an entity in search of a role. And I think that actually the Greens have a much clearer vision of what a potential new role for the European Union could be in terms of issues around climate change, that whole sort of issue about sustainability and human rights. I think the Greens have far more of a vision, actually, than a lot of other parties at the moment, where it's almost that the economy is becoming the goal. Economic growth, that was what Labour wanted from, a commissioner for growth. And you thought, well, I thought that was what they were all about, and this was part of the problem. But that feeling that almost the restarting the economy is becoming the goal, and that's not going to hack it for an awful lot of people.
Maggie?
I think there's a lot in there. There's if I tackle the Scottish question, obviously I've spoken a little bit about that. I think one of the things that Scotland does, and in some ways regardless of which way the debate, the vote goes in September, it shows that there is political space, if you argue for it, to be discussing progressive ideas. And that's not something that I think we have had a sense of in British politics. Now, I've lived in the UK for 16 years, so and it's certainly not been my experience in that time. Having a space that is actually legitimate to be talking about these ideas, that's something significant, I think, and it cannot fail to have an impact elsewhere in the UK, regardless of which way the vote goes. Obviously, in the event of a yes vote, the impact is maybe much greater, and I I hear that the concerns that others have around the rest of the UK. But in some ways, in relation to the first question around the power of the City of London, it's very, very clear to me that the City of London serves, or fails to serve the northeast of England. It fails to serve Belfast. It fails to serve the vast majority of the UK. And there is, if Scottish independence can produce a sort of not a counterpower at all, not a counterweight to that, but a shift to actually, hey, those uppity Scots, that they might be onto something here, because the only sense that the UK is a united kingdom. Well, I don't get a sense that the UK is a united kingdom in any sense other than what it looks like on a map, and even that's debatable, depending where you draw the lines. There isn't a unity of thought. There isn't a unity of identity. It's very interesting in the discussion around Scottish independence and whether it's a nationalist argument or not. On Better Together's website, the second word is patriotic. The first word is the. So it's the Better Together is the patriotic campaign for the United Kingdom. They are the ones bringing nationalism into this. That's the sense. Is that the United Kingdom that we all want? And certainly not a United Kingdom that I want, and not that I can speak for the rest of the UK, but there is something quite pernicious about that. And I think that sort of sense of identity, you talked about identity politics, John, and I think that notion of identity, of being, we know what this is, we know what this UK means, is completely bogus, because we would all come up with very, very different notions of what the UK identity would be. I think in terms of how that links to what we're talking about here, the role of the EU and where the EU itself is going, in the same way as the UK is mobilised in the interests of London. Well, the EU is mobilised. The European Union as a whole is mobilised in the interests of, I don't know who, the 80% of people currently negotiating TTIP and TAFTA trade agreements that are corporate lobbyists. Not politicians, certainly not ordinary people like you and me. Not that most of us are ordinary. We're sitting here on a Saturday morning talking politics. So I think there's something clearly lacking in the way that we think about as a country, as a collection of nations, as a collection of identities, as a collection of communities. That means that we actually don't. We've had the ability to be visionary beaten out of us, either literally or figuratively, and over the last few years. And I think that's what we need to get back. That's what I think the green movement can do. Jean's, I think, absolutely right when she says, the Greens are very well placed to do this. We just need to work out how we can talk to other people in a language that they understand. And in many ways, that's our problem as political parties, but it's also our problem in terms of community engagement. Me going and knocking on a door of a council estate in the East End of Glasgow. It's if I can talk about some of the things we've been talking about today, and think, what? I'm going to the food bank queue just now. How's that going to help? What are you going to do about that? So I think there's a huge challenge for us on the progressive left of politics across Europe. How do we make Europe matter to people? How do we say that actually a worker in Portugal should be of much a concern of mine as a crofter in Lewis, in the Outer Hebrides? How do we bring those communities of interest? How do we bring those politics together? And we have a way of doing that through the EU. I think we have a battle because the Farages of this world have absolutely no interest in that. The idea that UKIP's anti-establishment, I find completely bizarre. Millionaires, former bankers, current bankers, bankrolling an organisation that wants to be isolationist. How is that anti-establishment in any way? I don't get it. But yeah, I'll stop talking.
Great, wonderful.
Yeah, so concerning the role of the EU and what the Greens can do, I would say that the EU has been progressing and centralizing the decision making too fast in the last 20 years, and many people feel that they have not been part of that process at all, and they've been left behind, and they've had no chance really keeping up with the pace with which the EU has centralized the decision making. In Sweden, we didn't even get to vote on the Lisbon Treaty, for example. We didn't have a referendum on that, and people, they just feel that the EU is like taking more power to itself all the time, and I think actually that needs to stop. I think the EU should get a bit more power when it comes to environmental issues and human rights. But on all those other issues, I think it has to stop, because they don't have the people of the European Union with them when they are doing this. And I think one way of solving that problem is that you should allow countries, even more than today, to progress differently. Not all countries are members of the Euro, some are not. You could do that with a lot more of the parts of the EU cooperation, that it would be like voluntary for countries to be in or out. And it should not be the idea that everyone eventually should join, which it is today. I mean, they see the countries outside the Eurozone, they are supposed to join the Euro later. And if you're not part of the Schengen cooperation, you are supposed to join later. If you are not part of the cooperation when it comes to the military, you are supposed to join later. And I think they have to rethink that process. And in that case, I think the Greens are not really on the same issue in different countries. We don't see it the same. We in Sweden, as having been very skeptical about the EU from the Greens, we have seen that the German Greens, for example, we have totally different views on the way the EU should progress in the future when it comes to this centralization, decentralization process. They think that the more power to the EU, the better. And we think the more power to the Swedish parliament, the better. So maybe it has something to do with the fact that we feel that we have a bit more influence in the Swedish parliament, and the Germans feel that they are actually ruling the EU. So it might be one of the reasons for
Angela Merkel thinks we're working.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to the border issue, you can discuss it with Sweden. And Finland. We have the border to Norway. They are not members of the EU, and then Finland has the border to Russia, and they are not members of the EU. I think it's very differently solved in those two cases.
Yes, so now we get down to it. Political economy, which doesn't explain everything that goes on in the world, but I'm still sufficiently a recidivist Marxist at heart, I think, to realise the importance of which part of capital is in control. Has Labour stepped up to the plate, like the trade union movement, organised labour to negotiate a different deal? You know, the foundation of the welfare state, in many respects, gives some indication of perhaps one model of a reconfigured Europe in terms of what interests are going to prevail. I mean, in some ways, I'd be quite happy for Europe to be purely an economic union. If it was a green economy of the type that was outlined in the Green New Deal in terms of what many green parties supported across Europe. And what was interesting about that, which was unnoticed, I think, at the time, is that about 6 months before the Lehman Brothers crash, which precipitated the current crisis, the New Economics Foundation and the Green New Deal group, of which Caroline Lucas, Green MP, was a member, and Larry Elliott of The Guardian, and some other folk, wrote a report essentially predicting that this economic growth model based upon debt, based upon a Ponzi scheme of property speculation, of which, of course, the Republic of Ireland was a spectacular example of what goes wrong when you bet on a Ponzi scheme. A substantial part of that original report, which then fed out into aspects of this Green New Deal, so we're still sticking with the view of Europe that's an economic project, was about the reform of the financial system. I mean, quite a lot of that report was about, it's an issue I think progressives, Greens on the left had forgotten about for decades, was the important keystone issue of finance. Where are we going to raise the investment funds to reboot our economy, a new industrial revolution? So finance has to be part of that issue, and I definitely think Tanya's question is quite pertinent in that the City of London, in particular, would be fearful of anything that's going to threaten its interest, not least, forget about the regulation or a Tobin tax or a financial tax and so on, but the re-politicisation and indeed perhaps in part the re-nationalisation of aspects of finance in terms of why are we not directing the financial assets of our pension funds, which are managed, purely in terms of the single bottom line, towards investing in green infrastructure. On the island of Ireland, we have a great opportunity to completely reconfigure our entire electricity grid, which is singularly unfit for purpose for distributed renewable energy. That's a decades-long prospect, thousands of jobs, but it requires finance. So I think the issue of finance, at least, is now back on the table. But I also think as part of that Green New Deal, and this is what threatens financial capital and the idea that we can grow our way out of this crisis through the financial services, we're going to start making things again, folks. I think we're going to start making things again, which is why I certainly welcomed a lot of aspects of the Green New Deal discourse and policy options about a re-industrialisation. Not least because of here in Belfast. I mean, we built a leaky boat, but the Titanic was safe when she left Belfast. We say, built by an Irishman, sunk by an Englishman. But in the city of Belfast, in the dockyards, we had about 60,000 men working in the shipyards. We have lots of engineering expertise. What do we do now in Harland and Wolff? We're refitting Danish-designed, English and Scottish offshore wind turbines. We're doing what's called the monkey wrenching, the lowest end of the value chain, where the stuff is shipped here, we put it together because we're a low-wage economy. So we're participating marginally in a greening. I wouldn't call it a Green New Deal or a shifting towards a green economy. The kind of, at the margins, the greening of the existing model. Whereas why can't we see, this is partly with reference to Maria's point about experimentation, sustainability in a green economy is going to look different in Belfast, Berlin, Botswana, Belgrade, I'm running out of bees, Boston. It's going to look very different, so we need to have new experimentations locally. And certainly that's one that I think should be on the table, that particularly in terms of globalisation, which eventually worked this way. China made the goods of the world that we all enjoy. India is now coming into the frame. And we essentially provided the services, finance, education. I think that game is now coming to the end. And Europe is going to have to find a vision around making things again. I think particularly food is going to be an essential part of that, given particularly the carbon intensity of the food we make. Everything from food, from farm to fork, we need carbon energy. And therefore, how are we going to feed ourselves? And this is not to get alarmist and, Cormac McCarthy's The Road about it, It is to say that we have to come up with a vision which relates to these challenges, which Greens have talked about for years, but in a way I think that attends to these issues of identity, insecurity. I'm not saying all of these are going to be able to assuage those, but I do think we're smart enough to walk and talk at the same time. We can hold a number of often incompatible ideas in our head at the same time. That's called intelligence. And it is about seeing how Europe can be a forum to facilitate to it, what we're experiencing here today. This is Europe. This is what it can offer in terms of the facilitation of ideas, some of which may not work. But I do think we have to get real about finance, political economy, and even if we do say that Europe is purely an economic project, well, let's make it a green one. And I think that we'll be halfway there.
Okay, another round of questions.
I'm slightly concerned that we as a Green family are getting sidetracked by the slightly Eurosceptic kind of phrasing and terminology that we're having put up. I mean, even the title here, the UK relationship with the European Union. UK is within the European Union. So even some simple terminology like that makes a difference. But the other side of things is, I think a lot of the smaller parties on the right and left rising is down to socioeconomic insecurity at the moment. So the question is, can we, on a national level, actually deliver a better social future? Or do we not need actually to fully embrace Europe and actually push for something like a social market economy at the level of the European Union that is higher than what most other European Union member states have at the moment? Something that happened here in the 1940s and 50s, that pushed for the social market economy in that sense, which we haven't got at the European level, because a lot of these votes about immigration and so on come down to people having to leave their country because they don't have a job, they don't have a safe income where they live. So unless we address that at a European level, I don't really see how we can actually have successful even green economy, because this is the bread and butter issue at the end.
I want to make two comments. First, I wanted to react to Maria. I don't think it's a good way to this image that the EU is centralizing too fast and that it's not democratic. And of course, people are actually feeling left behind. I agree with that. But don't look also at the responsibility of the national governments, because they actually accept all the measures that are taken by the EU. It's not the EU who does that. It's a collaboration of national governments, and they agree to all these measures. But they use it in the parliaments by saying, if they don't like it, yeah, the EU is forcing us all these measures on us. And when they like it, what the EU is doing is saying, yeah, we arranged this, great, we are so good, you know. So I think it's too easy to say that, oh, the EU is centralistic. It is not. It is all the national governments agree with every step. So there's a lot of responsibility to the national governments to organize the way they communicate with their own people, I think. So I think it's not a good image to leave this level out of the discussion. And then the other thing, I agree that I think the problem for a lot of people, Eurosceptics, is that the social welfare state is linked to the national level. And people cannot imagine a social welfare state on a European level. And that's why they cling to this nationalism and to because they're afraid if we go, and that's also, I think, the reason for a lot of left-wing Euroscepticism, because they cannot imagine a social welfare state which is not national. And I think that's a very important thing where we have to work on. That's why I think a minimum loan, a minimum wage on a European level is something the Greens should really fight for. And measures like that, because then you are really doing something for people who up till now really did not profit from a lot of European measures. So this discussion, I think it's very important to again leave the national, and you know, in the beginning, in fact, the social measures were used by the nation states to promote the nation states. It's not the other way around. It's the nation states who were there, and they promoted themselves by all these social measures. But the idea of, in the beginning, it was an international movement for socialism and for social measures. And I think we have to go back to that. So I think this is a very important debate for the agenda.
I think that's interesting on that, because even if you do have all the national governments agreeing to something, I think the problem is that it doesn't necessarily mean that all the people have, and of course that's also a problem with the national governments and communicating. But kind of on that, the question I was going to ask was, to what extent do you think like the success of the anti-EU parties that we saw across Europe is down to just their policy in Europe, or to what extent it's down to kind of a sense of kind of coming back to identity, or kind of a sense that there's a political class kind of up there who kind of do everything and don't care about us and kind of do everything above us, and to what extent these kind of populist parties are seen as, even if of course they do come from these banking backgrounds in the city, to what extent they're seen as, whether they're the outsiders, they're different, and we're voting against the politicians and we'll put UKIP in. And kind of on that, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on any similarities between, say, the rise of UKIP and, say, the rise of Sinn Féin that we saw in the Republic of Ireland, which kind of ran in a sort of a similar kind of, we're the outsiders, we're different, even though, of course, they've been in government for, 10, 15 years, but kind of that sort of identity sort of thing.
Okay, I'd like to host another question. We take a few responses to those questions first, and then we come back to the others.
Yeah, I think you're right. In many ways, you are right. But there is also a process that is run from Brussels that EU should go in a certain direction, and that direction is never decentralization. And that's my point, that it's the feeling that they are like dragging us all along, more or less. And of course, we have a possibility to vote. And sometimes I totally agree with you that we should focus on our own government, what they are doing and not letting them get away with just blaming everything on the EU. So you're totally right there. When it comes to the issue of the social welfare state in Europe, I think from a Swedish perspective, nobody would support that, because we know that it would make it worse in Sweden than it is now. With the minimum wage, for example, it would mean that it would be politically acceptable to give wages that are much lower than the lowest wages that are politically acceptable in Sweden today. So we are very much afraid of that, actually, from a Swedish perspective.
Yeah, well, depends how you do it. And
we don't have a minimum wage in Sweden. Yeah. We don't have a minimum wage in Sweden. We have no national minimum wage. And the reason for that is that we actually believe that it would lower the lower wages and not increase them. So, and that's also the point of the trade union. They agree with this. When it comes to the anti-EU parties in the Nordics, I would say Sweden and Finland, half of the votes, I would say, is anti-immigration. Half of it is protest votes, more or less. Protests against, well, whatever. They are angry with lots of different things, but they vote for these parties because they are also angry with different things. So,
Jean?
Yeah, I think that in terms of the view that the success of some of these parties has been about being the outsiders. I mean, there's a degree of truth in terms of certainly how they present themselves. And I mean, of course, for us, this is, a bit of I suppose, a challenge to the Greens, because we always used to see ourselves as that. The classic, what was it, Petra Kelly's a sort of anti-party party. Whereas, and I think, what we're coming up against is almost the limits to that. You can't be outside and inside, but therefore it's a challenge to the way in which you do politics and the way in which you actually try and connect with people. And certainly some of the votes will be, again, I'm trying to think of the polite phrase for it, but it's the ultimate, sort of FU vote. That if you want, and we saw this in parts of London, other parts of England, when it was the British National Party that was getting elected at the local level in one or two places, and also with European Union seats, was that if you really wanted politicians to start paying attention to you and your area, you voted for the party that you thought was really going to upset the others. And that's, and so there is that element. It's a shock politics. It's a wake-up call to other political parties. I think there's more to it. With certainly with some of the parties like that actually have a clear and reasoned policy about why they don't want to be in the European Union. It's a perfect. I mean, it is a perfectly valid position. It's certainly one that my own party has had in the past as well. That there are questions to be asked. It's whether you then utilise the issues about migration as a means to have that debate. And that's where I think we've seen a big instrumentalisation of migration as an issue, and what that then does in terms of shock waves and making people feel very uneasy in their own identities, I think is one of the really nastiest things about this. And I mean, I've had some of the things that I've been at where London is possibly the most sort of multi-ethnic, multicultural city in the whole of the European Union, where people who are British nationals of, whether it's an Asian heritage or whatever, who are saying, I don't know that I belong here anymore. I feel really quite uneasy by the way this debate is taking off. And these are nationals, so I think that is something that really does need to be, confronted and worked with. In terms of the sort of the centralising part of the EU, I would agree that governments always, if it was a good idea, it was a government idea. If it was a bad idea, it's that lot in Brussels. And that I think national parliaments, there are some big questions for national parliaments about where they are within this, and whether they see themselves being disempowered or whether they see themselves as being part of the power relationships here. And the lack of real debate that happens within many national parliaments, certainly involving members of the European Parliament. Whoa, I mean, I know the Netherlands, really radical, has at least a day's debate in the national chamber involving the two groups. UK, well, we've only just started talking to each other, and that's, difficult. And we had this, some of you may watch Question Time, sort of Thursday night this week, where, there's all this, my God, Brussels is criticising us about our housing policy. How dare they criticise us? And you think, this is a process of the annual growth survey that's been going on for 3 or 4 years. The National Parliament debates this, sends the report in there. You are members of the National Parliament and you don't have a clue. As you can tell, it upset me. So, and I think that the issues about terminology, there's always that risk about sort of the language that you use and trying to be aware of it. But I think that part of what is also going on in here, in terms of whether it's the issues about economy, is that because the European Union deals with the international, it means that a lot of the time we never actually talk about the local. And therefore, this question about how the European Union can actually support or how it hampers the development of strong local economies is a debate that I don't think happens. And I think, it's one of the things that needs to happen. And as well, the minimum income guarantee framework directive, we can have a discussion on that. But the minimum wage, we've learned, we don't talk about minimum wage. It upsets the Danes, it upsets the Swedes, it upsets the social partners, which is why we came back to the minimum income. But
that's just Jane has made the point. I think you start on about basic income and not necessarily a minimum wage.
Well, that's another.
I know, it opens up a whole other range, but it certainly has more radical transformative potential, I think. But in terms of, I think it's a wonderful tweetable quote Jean has given us, FU to the EU. That's what the Euro-skeptic vote probably was. No. Attribute to me. Here's the thing, in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. And I think this is part of the problem that the non-Eurosceptic parties had. Europe, back to John's question, what is Europe? We lack a compelling narrative. This has got to sound odd in a way, but I'm a big fan of the centrality of narrative and indeed myth to understanding politics and mobilisation. It's the reason why I fear but respect nationalism. We have a debate with Maggie. I don't think what we see in Scotland necessarily is the type of nationalism I grew up with, which made me be very leery of it. Patriotism being the last refuge of the scoundrel, and the awful things that were, committed in the name of nationalism. But there is something about the centrality of a compelling narrative. What is the story that Europe is telling its citizens itself? And obviously that's a work in progress, and that's something that I think this election, and indeed probably the one before that in terms of Europe, is is a juncture in terms of what is the story of Europe, and it is around what can we fill that. And I think that's the reason why the likes of UKIP, or indeed I'd link it with more Forza Italia, that we have this phenomenon in Western liberal democracies where parties can be created overnight by often very wealthy individuals representing an elite, but who can pass themselves off as the dispossessed, as the outsider. And it's a trick that Americans know only too well. You get a similar phenomenon in America. You get someone like Ross Perot, a multi-billionaire who presents himself as a credible third force. His argument was kind of similar to the UKIP one. He was going to prevent jobs being sucked down to Mexico, this kind of race to the bottom argument. So there is this phenomenon that we need to be aware of. And I think it raises something that Jean had mentioned, and many of us in our discussions of these have talked about, is the power of the media. We have politics now as spectacle folks. This is bread and circuses. The time we're living in now is bread and circuses, in that UKIP was able to get a disproportionate amount of airtime, in which, even when Greens, as Jean said, when they got a chance to finish their sentences, what's your position on UKIP? Locally, I would say, as the Greens, we have a similar phenomenon. Why does the TUV and Jim Allister, with one member of the Assembly, along with Stephen Agnew, Green Party, gets a much smaller part of the airtime? So the role of the media in this, I think, is something quite significant. I was going to make a comment about the Shinners. Sorry, Sinn Féin, for those of you who are not local. They are the most partitionist party on this island. As a party that stands for Irish unification, they have played a blinder. And I'm absolutely despairing of unionists here in Northern Ireland, who I keep telling them, my DUP colleagues on the council I sit on, why aren't you hammering the Shinners for being two-faced and hypocritical? They are administering austerity politics. Okay, they're trying to fight it in a way in terms of resisting welfare reform here in Northern Ireland, and yet down south they're able to present themselves as the doughty fighters, burn the bankers but the bondholders and so on. And it's something that, I don't know whether even in the Republic of Ireland, which I've, in terms of media coverage, but that's come out, that this is a party that is schizoid, but it's able to catch, certainly down south, that populist anti-austerity, which I have to say is very real. I think part of the image for Europe now is that it's delivering austerity. That Angela Merkel and German bankers are the ones who are squeezing our belts and so on. And that's that the sundering or the stretching of those bonds of solidarity that once existed in Europe are certainly becoming strained because of the failed politics of austerity. You cannot cut your way to excellence, folks. You cannot cut your way to excellence, and that's exactly what the politics of austerity actually is. So I think to the extent that there is some, credible element to that Eurosceptic vote, I would have to say, I can see why people, if Europe is being presented as Angela Merkel presiding over the exploitation of Ireland, with the Troika, with the European Central Bank, and particularly its role in fueling or not regulating the Irish housing bubble, I think is an unwritten story in this. Yes, you could say ultimately it was the responsibility of the Irish government and property developers and the Golden Circle, but there was a European element to this story as well in terms of the European Central Bank. So I think it's that issue. If you're explaining, you're losing. So part of the challenge of Greens or those who are pro-European is, what is the story that we're telling about Europe now in the 21st century? And it can't be about, we're about peace and we're about avoiding war. That is necessary perhaps, but insufficient. And it is that, and I think the Greens have something to offer in terms of this Green New Deal, a politics of the 21st century, and particularly most radically, just to finish, is moving beyond economic growth. Now, there's a head shrinker for you. When every party in the European Union area is wanting us to get better, a bit like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, clicking their ruby red slippers, take us back to 2007, take us back to 2007. And we have to start asking questions, why do you want to go back there? To a debt-based, inequality-producing, human flourishing, diminishing economic system. So it is about, Greens do have answers about, maybe that's part of the new vision for Europe. It's beyond orthodox prosperity, or orthodox measurements, GDP, and so on. Again, that we have a long lineage in Green intellectual, philosophical history in that, and I think that may be something that we could gather ourselves around for a new vision for Europe.
Right, we have a couple of quick comments, then we're going to take another round of questions.
Okay, very, very quickly, I think, John, your articulation of that sort of centralising myth or centralising vision is very, very important. thinking about immigration as the problem, I mean, I think we have to move away from that. Immigration is absolutely not what the problem is austerity. That, plain and simple, to me. I think there's nothing else that even comes close to how idiotic an idea that this cutting to excellence actually is. And that can be, I think, one of our centralising visions, if you like, or centralising myths. Not how do we reform our markets? Because I don't believe the market actually, that isn't the solution. Jean used the phrase shock politics. And if you think about what Naomi Klein talks about in the shock doctrine, it is exactly, we see mirrored in our political structures exactly the same kind of thing as we see happening in our economic structures. People being cut out, people being disempowered, people having power taken away from them in a whole range of different ways. And what we need to get to is a social and environmental economy that allows people to take control of assets, allows workers to cooperate, allows workers to take control of their businesses. We've heard about citizens' income, European minimum wage, that kind of thing. But I think one element that maybe we've forgotten about here in this is how we relate to the world beyond Europe. Europe has benefited hugely through colonialism, imperialism, all that from the global south. And we cannot talk about a European vision and exclude any sort of sense of how we relate to the global south, whether it's in terms of resources, whether it's in terms of immigration and connection. But there has to be a relationship that we build into any future vision that includes those that aren't European.
Okay, question there.
Just ask a question on this whole question of fear and as somebody said, socio-economic insecurity is the bread and butter of some of these newer right-wing parties and also some on the left. And I do think that the type of debate that Maggie mentioned in Scotland, where 90% of the people end up debating something, doesn't take place anywhere else. And in fact, probably more people voted in the Eurovision Song Contest than in the European election. And they discuss football and all of these things. So I do think the whole way of getting the message across and overcoming this fear. I remember hearing a hardline loyalist on the radio talking one time he'd been in prison for killing somebody. He said, and Ian Paisley said, never said he held a gun or never shot anybody, but this guy, after listening to a speech by Ian Paisley, went home, got his gun and shot the first Catholic he met, killed him, because of the speech. So it's easy, I think, to stoke up fears and talk about insecurity. It's the easiest thing in the world to do. It's much more difficult to do what Eric was saying, to try and overcome, get cooperation. That is a much harder task, and I think this is one of the problems that Greens face in trying to overcome this rise. And it comes back to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that insecurity is the lower end of those needs. And if George Bush can say, look, scare most of the people in America and then tell them you're going to protect them and then you get re-elected. So this seems to be the ongoing dialogue. So it does come back to what John was saying, I think, about the power of the media and how do you get the political debate going. One commentator in Dublin spoke recently about they were talking about the green vote, whether it'll always be a percentage, there'll always be a bit of a green vote there. He said, yes, there is an educated subset of the middle classes who will always vote green. And to a certain extent that's true. And because all of the surveys and studies that have been done right throughout Europe said, yeah, even in Germany, that it's more educated people, more middle class that vote green and we're concerned about the future of the planet or whatever. And I do think that it has to, that message and the vision has to get out of that. So I do think this thing of fear and the power of the media, again, this is as McLuhan said, the medium is the message, and it's one of the areas where the Greens are not so good sometimes.
I've listened to all the speakers this morning with interest. It was great to hear about what's happening in Europe in terms of the austerity campaigns, the protest votes. John mentioned Sinn Féin in the Republic, huge amounts of votes for independence, UKIP in the UK. You could go through all of Europe, all these protest parties, a lot on the left and right. I'm wondering, where is the Green Party in all this? I would see us as a protest party. We're radical, we're different. Why aren't we in there in the mix and getting, 25, 30%? Maria mentioned in Sweden's 15%, reasonable percentages. But what about the mainstream conservative parties who are into economic growth, mainstream left-wing parties into economic growth? We're in the centre, or maybe to the left, maybe, but in terms of climate change, biodiversity loss, these huge issues which the average person, the average media person isn't taking on board. We should be radical and we should be able to get big protest votes, with a real policy behind this. I just don't understand the policy of the UKIP or Sinn Féin. If you actually ask them in detail what do they stand for, just a protest vote, we would have something positive in our protest. So I can't understand why across Europe the Green Party cannot be becoming the biggest party, given the huge issues of climate change and biodiversity loss that we face in terms and getting away from this model of economic growth, which is crazy.
Two questions, one there and then again on that.
One of the most frustrating things in the recent election, particularly in the European election, was the media's reporting of the election. And it's been touched on by a number of people here today about how we get the media interested. And I think that when we're talking about Europe, we're often talking about the issues in Europe. We're talking about things like transatlantic trade agreement, we're talking about things like fracking, climate change, energy, all the social issues. But yet the whole media debate was on the in or out referendum. It wasn't talking about the issues. And even when you had the debate between Clegg and Farage, it was never about what Europe is doing and what's doing badly and what's doing well. It was about how Europe benefits us and how it's a disadvantage to us. And really that meant that the whole election was framed on the basis of, do you want to be in, do you want to be out? And you weren't actually, there was no critique, there was no accountability for what parties, and particularly the likes of UKIP, what they had been doing for the last 4 or 5 years in the European Parliament, but not showing up, not actually voting, not actually even contributing anything useful, and things like opposing things like the ivory trade, they were voting against measures to stop illegal ivory trade. Crazy ideas. But the point of what I'm saying is that how do we actually change the media? How do we change it so that it's actually, or is there any mechanism that we can use so that the media are actually holding our parliamentarians in Europe to account for what they're doing? And particularly as well, just mention one final thing. I'll give you a good example. We brought Scott Kelly here to Belfast, and we couldn't even get a photographer from a paper, never mind an interview on local radio or TV, or anybody interested. Yet Farage swans into the Crown Pub, he's headline news in the Belfast Telegraph, and we really need to think, why is that? Why are the media not interested in us, and yet they're interested in what they're saying? And what can we do to change that?
Okay, last question. Yeah, I think these things, there's common themes here, like insecurity. I think economic insecurity has been a big driver. Yeah, that's one factor, but it's a combination of things. Insecurity on the one hand, in addition to that, the austerity policies coming together, so people have been insecure. Austerity policies have been affecting people in terms of their incomes. Not to say that it hasn't, obviously racism and also anti-immigration have been things with a significant section of the European population for decades, I would say even, but it's just because it's become more intense and it's been exploited by parties in the UK and the UK. They've been able to exploit insecurity, so additional people who may not have been racist or may not be anti-immigrant or may be susceptible but would have been so strong enough in the past because of insecurity and because of the media. It's that other thing, the media giving a lot of time to UKIP has, so these things have come together, insecurity, austerity. I think perhaps a longer term thing has been if I like to use this word, the deracination of class politics over the last several decades, and the increasing inability of social democracy to try and find solutions. I can remember developing as a young guy, as a teenager in the 70s, and then probably would have been more left-wing Labour, but would have been aware of things about the Greens. Seeing them come to power in various countries like France over the years, but other European countries, but not in most European countries, not really creating a successful economies and the reduction of inequalities all that successfully, especially when the economic crisis have appeared. social democratic charities have seemed to have been able to deal with it. So I think that deracination of the inability of social democratic politics to find solutions has contributed to a deracination of class politics. Working class people now working class people and lots of people now really are ideologicalist. They have no ideology now, so they float in more susceptible sections of that to far right parties.
All right, can we take 2 points, 2 responses from everybody? John, Maria.
I'm just going to try and say that, and I'm over exaggerating, but exaggeration is always when the truth loses its temper. A lot of this can be explained by our addiction to orthodox economic growth. Stick with me. What it has produced is a passive section of society. We're no longer active citizens. I mean, this has been mentioned. I mean, fear is easier to perpetuate when we are all being encouraged to be insecure about our body shape, that we're not cool unless we buy this stuff. The whole base of consumerism is based upon insecurity. The political expression of what that I think of it, you get like UKIP and xenophobia and so on, that insecurity, there is a connection between them, and particularly in relation to not just the deracination of class politics, but of democracy. You know, that sense of active citizenship. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not asking for that Oscar Wilde quote, socialism would be great except it take up too many evenings, about that. We have to be involved in everything. But there is something, how democratic is it, even when I've been elected in my local constituency, when less than 50% of people bothered voting. And that was pretty good in the context of other places. So there is something around part of this story of hope or vision. As the one good thing about Al Gore in that awful film, An Inconvenient Truth, because there's no politics in it apart from the credits at the end, is that hope is renewable. And that's something that we need to basically be articulating, is that sense of hope, but tied up with an engaged, reinvigorated sense of democracy. Because the thing is, if we don't take care of democracy, it requires work. There is no automatic button that we can say, oh, we've achieved democracy, we've had struggles, and you have the women's vote, lower age vote to 18, and so on. Oh, we're fine. No, we're going to start re-fighting battles that I think we thought we had won. And that's part of the democratic struggle. So the refounding of Europe is not just about it's a refounding of Europe, not just about reform of it. I think it's part of that democratic story of reinvigorating its sense of citizenship.
Well, it's difficult to decide what question to answer. Well, I have to say this about criticizing economic growth. I would say that it is a big challenge for the Greens to do that at the same time as the lack of economic growth have made like 50% of the young people in Spain going without a job. And we have to be able to explain that what we really want is to build an economy that will stand strong when we don't have economic growth. Because we won't have economic growth forever in this world, for certain. And what we want is to build a strong economy that will also stand strong when the economic growth is not there anymore. So I think that's important. And the other thing, well, when it comes to this media issue, I think it's very interesting because we used to complain about the media from the Green Party for like 20 years or something like that. And then we decided that we should stop complaining about the media and instead take politics seriously, talk to the media and give them proposals and try to explain to them what we really wanted, not only protesting against things, but trying to give them the proposals in advance and build a relationship with certain journalists and such things. And now the discussion in Sweden is actually that all the other parties are so annoyed that the journalists in Sweden are all green. They made a poll, and of course not all journalists answer these kind of polls, but they made a poll amongst journalists in Sweden, and over 50% said they were voting for the Green Party. So I think it might be changed, but I think it's important to take politics seriously, actually, not fall into this trap of making slogan politics. You have to take it seriously and stand for your proposals and not like bending when you're criticized and changing opinion. And especially when it comes to this immigration discussion, that you should never adjust to these political parties. That's what they did in Denmark. They took them into the government and thought that that would make them neutralized or something like that. But it didn't work. They only got stronger and stronger and stronger. And since we are on the total opposite side to them, the Greens are the strongest on the other side to those racists, anti-immigration parties, it's very important that we never adjust our politics to their, or our rhetorics to their rhetorics. So that's my final point of this discussion.
Maggie?
I think one of the things that's very clear, to echo some of the points that have already been made, if we're talking about how we move forward in Europe, as Europe, with Europe, very, very clearly our vision, and I think the Green vision has to be one of equality. It's not about economic growth, although I'm completely taking board what Maria said about how we tackle employment in certain parts of Europe. But if we're talking about equality, we need to make those stories talk to the people that to try and get beyond, and try and actually move us beyond just being talking to ourselves. To give you a very, very quick example, in Edinburgh in 2011, Scottish Parliament elections in 2011, in Edinburgh we talked about plastic bags and sand dunes, and our vote went up a little bit, but not very much. This year we talked about immigration. We were pro-immigration, pro-peace, and anti-austerity, and we nearly doubled our vote. Because those things matter to people. And that's something, as a political movement, we do very, very badly, is talk to people about things that matter to them. We talk to them about things that matter to us, in a language that matters to us, in the sort of language that I think somebody in UKIP actually says, well, of course nobody voted for UKIP in London because they're far too educated and cultured to do that. And we suffer from that because we talk in a language that is meaningless to the vast majority of the people that we want to represent, we want to serve, and who we want to make this world a better place for. And so we need to stop talking to ourselves. We need to start articulating that better world, that equal world, that peaceful world in a way that actually matters to somebody who doesn't have a job, somebody who's in the dole queue week after week, somebody who is in the food bank queue day after day. Because talking about plastic bags and sand dunes, well, it's not going to do it.
Jean.
I'd thoroughly agree with the idea about where you start where people are at. Yeah. Which doesn't mean that you can't then also introduce the issues or work with the issues that are important to you. But it's also the language in which you do it and what you start with on your list. That probably better to start with jobs than it is to start with climate change. But on the other hand, it's also, I think, one of these things where journalists are going to need challenging yet again with this idea that, I think Newsnight had a discussion on election night when we were waiting in City Hall in London for hours, where they almost ended up describing the Greens as this sort of niche boutique politics. And I thought, well, one, you didn't read a single thing we put through your door then, because no way was that niche and boutique. But, it was this way of sort of pigeonholing us so that then you don't have to talk about us. That, okay, we beat the Lib Dems everywhere, but don't mention the word Green. I mean, the complaints that have gone in on this. There's, Conservatives into third place, and the Lib Dems into fifth.
Yeah.
Fourth! Absolutely inability to mention it, partly because what we talk about, I think, is a lot of the time it is actually quite challenging. Maybe partly vocabulary, but the ideas are too. Mm-hmm. And we had the same sort of issue with SCAR, that we're trying. One of the things there was trying to create a context within which SCAR became relevant. And of course, if you've got who was standing as sort of 1 to 2 lead candidates for the Greens, with and this argument that's now going on about whether Juncker should lead the Commission, he's saying, see journalists, this is why Scar was here, because she was our candidate for this job that's now giving Cameron sleepless nights. But we have found that it's a huge problem with journalists that, for whatever reason, do not, cannot, won't, etc., even try and begin to get their heads around the European level. beyond the easy slogans, you know, beyond the it takes all the power, it does whatever. Don't want to engage. And so I think you know, we're certainly looking at how we get beyond that within this new Parliament. And indeed, you know, just talk to people directly. I mean, you know, blow the journalists. I mean, this is one of the great things now. You've got, you know, Twitter, Facebook, a whole set of other ways. Even in my own case, you know, this is sort of information monies we get from the Parliament. We've even produced, you know, 150,000 A4 newsletters. I've got people in, you know, local party members in London who go and stick them through people's doors. Well, you know, I mean, it's a bit old school, but it does at least mean that, you know, they vaguely heard something. So, you know, and this idea that we end up bypassing them. But I do think that it's also this challenge too, that this feeling that a lot of people can only begin to care about the planet when they're rich enough, etc. It's not true. We know it's not true. We get Greens elected in some of the poorest parts of the country because, you know, people still actually care about the quality of their air, about the water they drink, whether their kids are safe on the streets, and they don't actually want to be in a job that's going to kill the planet. You know, it might be the only one that's out there, and the government pushes them into it, but that's not really what most people want to do. And I think that in terms of those sort of issues about values and that sort of direction, a lot of people do connect, but we still have, it's true, enormous challenges in making that connection.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm really sorry we're going to have to bring this to a close. We've gone over slightly, but I've found it a fascinating panel discussion. Can you join me in thanking our panellists for their contribution?
This has been a Join the Cool production for the Green Foundation Ireland. To find out more, visit their website greenfoundationireland.ie.